The hidden truth behind America's most forgotten muscle car, and honestly once you hear this, you're going to be genuinely angry at what Detroit did. Because this isn't some obscure story that got lost by accident. This got buried on purpose, and the people who did it were the same people who were supposed to protect it. Let's talk about the Oldsmobile 442. And before you click off thinking you already know this car, I promise you don't know this version of the story. Nobody really talks about this part. They'll tell you it was fast, they'll throw up some photos of that aggressive hood and those muscle lines, and they'll move on. But what actually happened to this car, the real sequence of events that went down inside General Motors, that part gets skipped every single time and I genuinely don't understand why. So if you've ever felt like Detroit sold its own fans out during the muscle car era, drop a comment below because by the end of this you're going to have a lot of thoughts. The 442 came out in 1964 and the name itself told you exactly what you were dealing with. 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed transmission, dual exhausts. That was the whole formula right there, baked into the badge. Oldsmobile wasn't being subtle about what this car was. And in those early years it built a reputation that was completely legitimate, not manufactured by a marketing department, just earned on the street and on the strip by people who actually drove the thing. By the late 60s the car had evolved into something genuinely serious. The W30 package, which is where things get really interesting, took the 400 cubic inch engine and turned it into something that embarrassed cars with way more displacement. Functional ram air induction, low-restriction exhaust manifolds, a hotter cam, and those distinctive red plastic inner fender liners that actually directed cold air into the engine. Real engineering, not cosmetic stuff. A W30-equipped 442 was running the quarter mile in the mid-13th straight from the factory, and that's not a small thing, that's genuinely fast for 1969 and 1970. And here's what really gets me. In independent testing, the W30 was keeping pace with and sometimes beating the big block Chevelles, the 440 Mopars, cars that had way more cubic inches and way more corporate muscle behind them in terms of promotion. Car and Driver ran tests, Motor Trend ran tests, and the 442 W30 came out looking incredible. So you had a legitimate performer, proven numbers, a real fanbase that was growing, and Oldsmobile had the chance to go all in and make this thing a true icon. They didn't. And this is where the story turns. General Motors had this internal corporate policy, and I want you to really sit with this because it's one of the most self-destructive decisions a car company ever made from the inside. GM had a displacement limit for their midsize cars. Nothing over 400 cubic inches in a car below full size. That was the rule. And the reason it existed was basically internal politics. Chevrolet didn't want Oldsmobile or Pontiac stealing thunder with a bigger engine, so there was this quiet agreement to keep the divisions from cannibalizing each other. Meanwhile Mopar was putting 426 HEMAS and 446 packs into midsize cars with zero hesitation. Ford was dropping 428 Cobra Jets into Fairlanes. And GM's answer was to handcuff its own performance divisions with a cubic inch ceiling that existed for corporate political reasons, not engineering reasons, not safety reasons, just internal turf protection. Now to their credit, engineers at Oldsmobile found ways to work around this. The W30 package was brilliant precisely because it extracted maximum performance from the displacement they were allowed. But there was this constant tension between what the engineers wanted to build and what corporate would allow them to build, and that tension, over time, started showing up in the product. Like and subscribe right now if you're finding this interesting because this story goes even deeper and I don't want you to miss the part where it actually gets worse. Then 1970 hits and for one shining moment it looked like things might actually change. GM lifted the displacement ban, briefly, and Oldsmobile responded with the W32 option, which stuffed a 455 cubic inch engine into the 442. 455 cubic inches. The torque numbers on that engine were absurd, something like 500 pound-feet, and the car felt completely different to drive, just this wall of torque that hit immediately and didn't stop. And the 1970 442 with that engine is genuinely one of the most underrated muscle cars ever built. Not underrated like people say things are underrated online just to say it. Actually underrated, as in the people who drove them knew what they had, but the broader public never gave it the same recognition as a 1970 Chevelle SS 454 or a 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda, even though the Oldsmobile was right there competing with both of them. Part of that is marketing, and this is where the betrayal really starts to crystallize. Chevrolet had the Chevelle and GM poured resources into promoting it. The Chevelle got the magazine covers, the dealership floor space, the advertising budgets. Pontiac had the GTO, which was still trading on its reputation as the car that started the whole muscle car segment. And Oldsmobile's 442 was kind of just there, being fast without anyone really telling people it was fast. The car was doing the work and the company wasn't showing up to support it. I think about this sometimes honestly, like if you had a product that was genuinely competing with the best things in its category and you just didn't bother to tell anyone, what does that say about how much you actually believed in it? Because Oldsmobile had something real with the 442 and the W30 and the 455, and they kind of treated it like a side project while the real attention went elsewhere inside GM. Then the insurance industry got involved, and this part affects the whole muscle car era, but it hit the 442 particularly hard because it didn't have the same cultural armor that some of the bigger names had. Insurance companies in the late 60s and early 70s started classifying high-performance cars as high-risk, and the premiums got genuinely ridiculous. A young buyer who could technically afford the car payment couldn't afford to insure it, and that demographic, young guys who wanted performance, that was exactly the buyer the 442 was built for. Sales started softening, and instead of fighting for the car, instead of finding creative ways to market around the insurance problem or reposition the vehicle, what did Oldsmobile do? They started detuning it. The 1971 model year brought lower compression ratios because of the incoming unleaded fuel regulations, and the power numbers dropped noticeably. The car started feeling different, and not in a good way. And this wasn't unique to Oldsmobile, every American muscle car went through this, but the 442 had less goodwill stored up with the general public to survive the transition, and that's a direct consequence of the years of underinvestment in marketing and promotion. By 1972, the 442 was no longer really a muscle car in the traditional sense. It was becoming more of a handling and appearance package, which sounds fine until you realize that's basically admitting defeat. The engine options got softer, the whole identity of the car started blurring, and the buyers who had been passionate about it started drifting toward whatever still felt alive in the muscle car world, which wasn't much by that point, but still. And here's the part that I genuinely find hard to process. The people inside Oldsmobile who worked on the W30, the engineers who figured out how to build that cold air induction system, who tuned that engine to pull numbers it had no business pulling given its displacement, those people knew what they had. There are interviews from that era where engineers talk about the 442 with this real pride, this sense that they'd built something special and were frustrated watching it get handled the way it got handled. One engineer, talking years later about the W30 development, basically said they felt like they were always fighting uphill, fighting the displacement rules, fighting for budget, fighting for marketing support, and then fighting the emissions regulations that came down like a wall. They built a genuinely fast car in a genuinely hostile environment, and the company they worked for didn't fully back them up when it mattered. That's the betrayal. Not some dramatic single moment where an executive stood up and said, "We're killing this car." It was quieter and almost worse than that. It was a series of decisions to look the other way, to prioritize other nameplates, to not fight the insurance industry's narrative, to not lobby internally for the displacement exemptions that would have kept the car competitive. Death by 1,000 non-decisions. The 442 nameplate actually survived into the 80s, which honestly almost makes it worse. By 1985, Oldsmobile brought the name back on what was essentially a front-wheel drive Cutlass Calais with a 4-cylinder engine. A 4-cylinder. They put the 442 badge on a 4-cylinder economy car, and I don't even know how to explain how that decision got made, but it did, and it happened, and if you owned one of the original W30 cars, you have every right to be upset about that. The name that stood for 4-barrel, 4-speed, dual exhaust, the name that was on cars running 13-second quarter miles in 1969, got put on a car with a 4-cylinder engine in 1985, and that's not a stumble, that's not a pivot, that is a complete failure to understand what the name meant to the people who cared about it. And maybe that's the real answer to whether Detroit betrayed its fans. Because a company that actually understood its audience would have known that you don't put that badge on that car. You would have known that the people who bought the original 442, who stayed loyal to it through the detuning and the insurance nightmare and the emissions regulations, those people weren't just buying transportation. They were buying into something that meant something to them. The 1974 42 W30 with the 455, that car deserved to be remembered the way the 1970 Chevelle SS 454 is remembered. It deserved the magazine covers and the diecast models and the Restomod builds and the internet arguments about whether it could beat a modern Hellcat. It earned that. The engineers earned it, the car earned it. What it got instead was a slow fade, a diluted identity, and eventually its own name used against it on a car it would have embarrassed in a straight line. That's not forgetting something. That's something closer to abandonment. So the next time someone asks you about forgotten muscle cars, remember that some of them weren't forgotten by the public first. Some of them were forgotten by the people who built them, and the public just followed that lead because when the people making a thing stop believing in it, it shows. It always shows. The 442 deserved better. The fans who bought it deserved better. And honestly, the engineers who built the W30 in the middle of all those restrictions and politics and budget fights, they deserved better than watching their work get a 4-cylinder badge slapped on it 16 years later. That's the hidden truth. And now you know it.